I never meant to get involved. I rode into Redwick at midday with nothing but a short list: salt, iron nails, a sack of coarse coffee for the coming winter, and a tired horse I'd rented from the last village. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the dusty streets into an oven. I kept my cloak loose, my sword hidden beneath it, and my eyes on the ground. After 8 years on the border and 3 more drifting alone in the hills, I'd learned the safest path through any town was the one that didn't draw attention. But attention found me anyway. The crowd was thick around the old stockade pen, the kind used for breaking horses or holding thieves. Today it held something else. A roar rolled through the square like thunder trapped in a barrel. Men and women pressed shoulder to shoulder, faces red with heat and excitement, fists pumping the air. In the center, a thick rope had been thrown over the crossbeam of the old whipping post, and at the end of that rope hung a woman. Not a woman. An orc. She was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, even while dangling, shoulders broad as a barn door, arms corded with muscle that still twitched with the last of her strength. Her bare feet kicked weakly above the dirt. The noose had bitten deep into the green skin of her neck, leaving a livid bruise that looked almost black under the brutal sun. Her black hair, matted with sweat and dust, hung across a face carved from stone, high cheekbones, small tusks curving upward from her lower jaw, and eyes the color of molten amber. The crowd screamed for blood. "Hang the beast! String her higher! Make the monster dance!" I reined my horse to a stop at the edge of the square. My knuckles went white on the reins. I had seen executions before. I had carried out a few myself during the border wars. But this wasn't war. This was entertainment. The orc's head lifted slowly as if every inch cost her the last of her breath. Her gaze swept the roaring faces, then locked onto mine. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She simply looked at me, steady and burning, like she was asking one silent question across the distance. "Do you dare?" Something inside my chest cracked open. I had ridden away from plenty of ugly scenes in my life. One more wouldn't change the color of my nightmares. But in that single heartbeat, I knew if I turned my horse now, I would carry her eyes with me until the day I died. I swung down from the saddle. The moment my boots hit the dirt, the noise shifted. Heads turned, voices faltered, then surged again, now aimed at me. "Who the hell is that?" "Stay out of it, stranger." "Mind your own business." I walked forward anyway, cloak flapping behind me, hand resting on the hilt of my old sword. The crowd parted just enough to let me through, the way water splits around a rock it can't move. At the center, a thick-necked man in a stained leather vest gripped the free end of the rope, grinning like a carnival barker. Behind him stood a younger man on horseback, barely 20, armor polished to a mirror shine, a black cloak embroidered with a silver hawk. Lord Roderick Varaine, the young lord of Redwick. His face was handsome in the way marble statues are handsome, cold, perfect, and utterly without mercy. I stopped 10 paces from the post. The orc still hung there, toes brushing the ground, chest heaving in shallow gasps. Her amber eyes never left mine. Lord Roderick's voice rang out, sharp and amused. "This is no concern of yours, traveler. The beast was sentenced by my court. Move along." I looked up at the rope, then back at him. "Your court turned justice into sport." A ripple of uneasy laughter went through the crowd. Roderick's smile thinned. "Careful. Insulting my law in my town is a dangerous game." I drew my sword. The hiss of steel leaving the scabbard cut through the noise like a whip. The crowd gasped and stumbled back. A few men reached for knives. Roderick's hand flew to his own hilt. I didn't wait for permission. I stepped up to the post, raised my blade, and brought it down in one clean stroke. The rope parted with a sharp twang. The orc dropped like a stone. She hit the ground on her knees, coughing violently, one massive hand clawing at her bruised throat. For a single breath, the entire square went dead silent. Then it exploded. "Seize him! Traitor! Kill the outsider!" Roderick spurred his horse forward, sword flashing free. "You dare defy me in my own square?" I turned to face him, blade low and ready. The orc was still on her knees behind me, gasping for air. I planted my boots and spoke loud enough for every ear in the square to hear. "One fight, you and me. If I win, she leaves with me." Roderick stared down at me from his saddle, then threw back his head and laughed. "A lone sellsword thinks he can dictate terms to the Lord of Redwick?" He swung off his horse in one fluid motion, cloak flaring. "Very well, but when I carve your heart out, I'll hang her from the same rope right beside your corpse." The crowd roared approval and surged back, forming a wide circle in the dust. Sunlight glinted off steel. My heart beat steady in my ears, the old rhythm I thought I had left behind on the border. I raised my sword. The orc behind me pushed herself to her feet, swaying but upright. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. This was no longer about salt or nails or coffee. This was about the line I had just crossed. And there was no stepping back. Lord Roderick moved like a dancer, every step precise, every cut elegant. His blade flashed in the harsh sunlight as he tested me, probing for weakness with the confidence of a man who had never lost in front of his own people. He wanted to make this quick, clean, and humiliating. I fought like someone who had survived nights where the only rule was stay alive. He lunged with a high slash meant to split my skull. I slipped inside the arc, my old sword ringing against his as I twisted my wrist and morsed his blade wide. The crowd roared. Roderick's eyes narrowed, surprised that a dusty traveler had parried him so easily. "You're fast," he admitted, circling me. "For a dead man." I didn't answer. Words were his weapon. Mine was the 3 feet of steel in my hand. He came again, faster this time. 3 cuts in a flashing combination taught in noble fencing halls. I blocked the first, ducked the second, and met the third with a brutal upward stroke that jarred his arm. He stumbled back a step, shaking out his wrist. For the first time, doubt flickered across his perfect face. The square had gone mad. Men shouted bets. Women screamed for blood. Stones and clumps of dirt flew toward me from the edges of the crowd. I ignored them all. My world had narrowed to the young lord and the orc woman still trying to stand behind me. Roderick attacked again, pressing his advantage in reach and armor. His sword whistled past my ear, close enough to slice a lock of hair. I countered low, aiming for the gap below his breastplate. He leaped back, but not before my tip scored a shallow line across his thigh. Blood welled up, bright against the silver of his greaves. The crowd gasped. Their golden boy was bleeding, Roderick's face twisted with fury. He charged, all grace gone, swinging wildly. I let him come, then dropped low at the last second and swept his legs. He crashed to the dirt with a metallic clang, sword flying from his grip. Before he could rise, I placed the point of my blade against his throat. Silence fell like an axe. I could feel every eye on us. One twitch of my wrist and the young Lord of Redwick would die in the dust. Part of me wanted to do it, the part that remembered every innocent life I had watched end for sport or spite. Instead, I spoke loud enough for the entire square to hear. "I win. The orc leaves with me." Roderick stared up at me, chest heaving, eyes burning with humiliation. "You'll regret this, Thorn," he hissed. "Tonight I'll come for both of you, and when I do, I'll hang you side by side." I pulled my sword away and stepped back. "Then I'll be waiting." I turned to the orc woman. She had pushed herself to her feet, one massive hand still clutching her bruised throat. She was breathing hard, but her amber eyes were steady. I offered her my shoulder. For a moment she hesitated, pride warring with exhaustion. Then she leaned on me, her weight nearly buckling my knees. She was heavier than any human I had ever carried, solid muscle and bone. Together we walked through the parting crowd. Insults rained down. Someone threw a stone that bounced off my cloak. Another spat at our feet. I kept my sword in my right hand, ready. The orc, Mara, said nothing, but her free hand stayed close to the small axe tucked in her belt. We reached the edge of the square. My rented horse waited nervously. I helped her mount first, then swung up behind her. She was so tall that even sitting in front of me she made the horse look small. I kicked the animal into a trot, then a canter, putting Redwick behind us as fast as I dared. The road north wound through dry hills and scattered scrub. The sun beat down mercilessly. Mara rode in silence, her broad back rigid against my chest. Every so often I felt her sway and tighten my arm around her waist to keep her steady. She never thanked me. She never complained. She simply endured. By the time the sun began to sink, we reached the narrow trail that led up to my cabin beneath the Gray Barrow Hills. The wooden house sat small and weathered against the slope, smoke no longer rising from the chimney because I had been gone 3 days. I helped her down. She staggered once, then caught herself. "Inside," I said. She followed me through the door without a word. The single room was dim and cool. I lit the lantern, then the hearth. While the fire caught, I filled a basin with water from the barrel and brought it to her. She sat on the edge of the only chair, massive frame making it look like a child's seat. I handed her a clean cloth. She took it and began to clean the raw skin around her neck, movement slow and deliberate. I busied myself making coffee, the only thing I knew how to prepare well. When it was ready, I poured 2 cups and set one in front of her. She looked at the steaming mug, then at me. "My name is Mara Stonejaw," she said, voice rough as gravel. "Alden Thorne," I replied. She lifted the cup with both hands and drank. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. Outside, night had fallen. Somewhere in the darkness, Lord Roderick would be gathering men. I knew it. She knew it. Mara set the empty cup down and met my eyes across the small table. "You should have left me hanging," she said quietly. I shook my head. "I've left too many people behind already." She studied me for a long time, amber eyes unreadable. Then she spoke again, softer than before. "Tonight, they will come." I nodded, hand resting on the hilt of my sword. "Then we'll be ready." The fire burned low between us, 2 strangers bound by a single cut of steel, waiting for the storm that was already riding toward our door. Dawn came cold and sharp, the kind of light that cuts through the cracks in the walls like a blade. I stepped outside to repair the section of fence the wind had battered during the night. The ground was still damp from yesterday's dust storm, and my boots left deep prints as I dragged a heavy pine log toward the broken posts. I had just bent down to lift one end when I heard her footsteps behind me. Myra stood there, tall as a mountain in the gray morning. The bruises around her neck had darkened to deep purple, but her posture was straight, unyielding. Without a word, she walked over, bent at the knees and wrapped her massive hands around the log I had been struggling with. She lifted it as if it weighed nothing, carried it to the hole, and set it down with a solid thud. I stared at her. She didn't look at me. She simply waited, hands open, ready for the next task. We worked like that all morning. I held the post steady while she drove it deep into the earth with the back of her axe. I stretched the wire. She held the tension. I handed her nails. She hammered them in with 3 precise strikes. Not once did she speak. Not once did she complain about the pain in her neck or the exhaustion that still lingered in her limbs. She simply worked, her amber eyes focused, her green skin glistening with sweat under the rising sun. By midday, the fence stood stronger than before. I wiped my brow and glanced at her. She was breathing steadily, but the raw marks on her throat looked worse in the daylight. I went inside, filled a bowl with cool water from the barrel, and brought it out with a clean cloth. She took it without thanks, dipped the cloth, and pressed it gently to her neck. Her eyes never left the horizon. In the afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of coming rain. Dark clouds gathered over the hills. I moved the horses into the small barn and barred the door. Myra helped without being asked, lifting heavy feed sacks and stacking them against the walls as if they were feathers. When the first fat drops began to fall, we retreated inside. I lit the fire again. The flames rose, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Outside, the rain hammered the roof like distant drums. Inside, the only sound was the crackle of burning wood and the slow drip of water from the eaves. Myra sat near the hearth, knees drawn up, arms resting on them. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the strong line of her jaw and the small tusks that curved from her lower lip. She stared into the flames for a long time before she spoke. My own clan hung me. Her voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. I froze, the poker still in my hand. She continued without looking at me. "I am Myra Stonejaw of the Ashkar. I was their strongest warrior. They wanted me to marry the son of the rival chieftain. A blood alliance for land and power. I refused. I said I would not be traded like cattle. They called it betrayal. That night they bound my hands, dragged me across the border, and gave me to the humans of Redwick as a gift. A monster for their amusement. They told Roderick to make an example of me." She touched the bruises on her neck, fingers tracing the dark marks. "So they did." The fire popped. Rain lashed the windows. I set the poker down slowly. "You refused a marriage." And they condemned you to death for it? Mara nodded once. In my clan, refusal is worse than cowardice. It shames the bloodline. They erased me. I no longer exist to them. I sat down across from her, the weight of her words settling heavy in my chest. I had cut one rope, but I had walked straight into a war older and deeper than Redwick's petty laws. Outside, the storm howled louder. Then, beneath the rain, I heard something else. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, then clearer. Fresh tracks in the mud earlier that day had not been my imagination. Someone had been watching. I stood, sword already in hand. Mara rose with me, picking up the heavy wood axe she had used earlier. She tested its weight, eyes gleaming in the firelight. "They will come tonight," she said quietly. I looked at her, this towering warrior who had been betrayed by her own blood, condemned by strangers, and saved by a man she owed nothing to. "Then we'll meet them," I said. She met my gaze, and for the first time since I cut her down, the smallest flicker of something like respect passed between us. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder. Inside, the fire burned on, and two outcasts stood ready in the small wooden house that had suddenly become the center of a war neither of us had asked for. The first arrow punched through the shutter with a sharp crack, trailing fire. It buried itself in the far wall, flames licking up the dry wood like hungry tongues. I lunged forward, yanking the burning bolt free and stamping it out beneath my boot while smoke stung my eyes. "Down!" I shouted. Mara was already moving. She grabbed the heavy table and flipped it onto its side in one motion, creating a barricade across the front of the single room. Another arrow whistled through the broken shutter, then a third. Outside, Lord Roderick's voice rose above the storm. "Burn them out! Light the roof!" A clay pot smashed against the wall, oil exploding in a sheet of flame. The fire raced across the floorboards. I snatched a blanket, soaked it in the water barrel, and beat the flames down while Mara stood at the window, axe raised. When the first man tried to climb through the shattered shutter, her axe came down like judgment. The blade caught him in the shoulder with a wet crunch. He screamed and fell back into the night. I joined her at the window. Roderick's men were everywhere, shadows with torches and drawn swords circling the cabin. The rain had turned to sleet, hissing as it struck the flames. I could see Roderick on horseback at the edge of the yard, cloak whipping in the wind, pointing and shouting orders. "They want the house," I said. "We can't let them trap us inside." Mara nodded once. Without warning, she kicked the door open and charged into the sleet. I followed, sword ready. The night became chaos and steel. 3 men rushed her at once. Mara roared, a sound that shook the bones, and swung her axe in a wide, brutal arc. The heavy blade sheared through a spear shaft and into the man behind it. I took the one on her left, my sword sliding under his guard and opening his thigh. He dropped, screaming. The third turned to run, and Mara's axe caught him between the shoulders. More came. I lost count. The sleet stung my face, mixed with sweat and blood. I fought low and dirty the way border skirmishes had taught me, cut hamstrings, smash elbows, drive the pommel into faces. Mara fought like an avalanche. Every swing of her axe cleared space. Every roar sent men stumbling back in terror. We moved together without needing words, back to back when the circle closed, side by side when it opened. My sword rang against steel. Her axe split shields. Blood sprayed across the snow-dusted ground and froze almost instantly. A torch flew through the air and landed on the roof. Flames caught the dry thatch. I cursed and started toward the house, but Mara grabbed my arm. "Leave it," she growled. "They want us out here." She was right. Roderick was trying to force us into the open. I turned back to the fight. Lord Roderick himself finally rode forward, sword raised, face twisted with rage. "Traitor!" he screamed at me. "You chose the monster over your own kind!" I met him in the middle of the yard. Our blades crashed together, sparks flying in the sleet. He was good, fast, trained, angry. But anger made him reckless. I parried, stepped inside his reach, and drove my shoulder into his chest. He toppled from the saddle. Before he could rise, I pressed my sword to his throat. "Call them off," I said, breathing hard. His eyes burned with hatred. "Never!" Behind me, Mara roared again. I heard bodies hit the ground. Roderick's men were breaking. Some were already running. The roof of my cabin was fully ablaze now, flames leaping into the night sky, lighting the entire yard in flickering orange. Roderick spat blood. "This isn't over, Thorn. I'll burn every hill until I find you both." I lifted my blade. For a heartbeat, I considered ending it. Then I stepped back. "Take your dead and go," I said. "Tonight you lost. Tomorrow is another day." He glared at me, then shouted the order to retreat. His surviving men dragged the wounded away, leaving dark trails in the snow. Roderick mounted his horse last, eyes promising murder, before spurring away into the darkness. The yard fell quiet except for the roar of the burning cabin and the hiss of sleet on flames. I turned to Myra. She stood among the fallen, axe dripping, chest heaving. Blood, not hers, streaked her green skin. She looked at the burning house, then at me. I expected her to say something about the loss. Instead, she simply nodded once, as if accepting a new truth. The cabin was gone. Everything I owned was turning to ash and smoke. But my era was alive, and for the first time since I cut that rope, I felt something close to peace. Then we heard new hoofbeats, many of them approaching from the north. Myra stiffened. My clan. The orcs had come, and the night was not over yet. The orcs came at first light, 30 riders on black horses emerging from the mist like ghosts of the mountains. Their armor was dark iron, spears held high, and at their head rode an elder with silver-streaked hair and a face carved by decades of war. He carried a ceremonial staff topped with a carved wolf skull. Mara stepped forward alone, axe still in her hand, blood drying on her arms. I stayed behind her, sword ready, but this was not my fight to finish. The elder's voice rolled across the yard like distant thunder. "Mara Stonejaw, you were sentenced to die for shaming the clan, yet you live. Explain yourself." Myra lifted her chin. The bruises on her neck stood out dark against her green skin, but her voice was steady and clear. "I live because this human cut the rope. I live because I chose not to die for a marriage I never wanted. I live because I will no longer be traded like cattle or hanged for sport." Murmurs rippled through the riders. Spears shifted. The elder's eyes narrowed. "You refuse the alliance. You stand with a human. You spit on blood and tradition." "I spit on chains," Mara answered. "If that makes me dead to the clan, then bury my name. But I will not return." The elder studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into a pouch at his belt and drew out a string of beads, small bones and red stones bound with worn leather. He tossed it at her feet. "You are no longer Ashkar. Keep this. It is all that remains of what you once were." Without another word, he turned his horse and led the warband away. The sound of hooves faded into the hills, leaving only silence and the smell of smoke from the ruined cabin. Myra stared at the beads on the ground. Her massive shoulders rose and fell once. She bent down, picked them up with both hands, and held them like something both precious and poisonous. I walked over and stood beside her. The morning sun was climbing now, painting the snow-dusted yard in pale gold. "They disowned you," I said quietly. "They set me free," she replied. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she did not cry. We spent the rest of the day in silence, cleaning what could be saved. I swept ash from the stone foundation. She lifted charred beams as if they were kindling and stacked them for firewood. By afternoon, the worst of the damage was cleared. The cabin itself was gone, but the stone hearth still stood and the root cellar beneath it had survived. That evening, we sat on the porch steps of what remained, sharing the last of the coffee I had boiled over an open fire. Mara turned the string of beads over in her hands again and again. "My mother gave me the first bone on this chain when I took my first life in battle," she said. "Each one after that marked a victory, a life taken for the clan. Now they return it to mark the life they tried to take from me." I looked at the beads, then at her. "You don't have to carry them if they hurt." "I will carry them," she said, "to remember what I left behind and what I chose instead." She reached out and placed the string of beads into my palm. Her fingers lingered against mine. "Keep them for me, Alden Thorne. In this house that is no longer a fortress but a beginning." I closed my hand around the beads. They were warm from her touch. The days that followed were quiet and steady. We rebuilt. I cut new logs with the axe she had used in battle. She carried them down from the hills on her shoulders. Together we raised a smaller cabin on the old stone foundation. Tight walls, a strong roof, and a wide hearth where the fire never went out. Mara learned to use a saw. I learned to move without fear of her strength. At night we sat by the fire, and she told me stories of her clan while I told her of the border wars I had survived. Slowly the bruises on her neck faded to faint shadows. Slowly the walls I had built around myself began to crumble. One spring morning I found an old wooden cradle in the root cellar, something my mother had kept for a child that never came. I carried it upstairs and set it near the hearth. Myra watched me place the string of beads inside it, the bones and red stones resting gently against the smooth wood. She stood beside me for a long time, her shoulder touching mine. "Once this chain bound me to death," she said. "Now it rests in a cradle. A new life begins where the old one ended." I took her hand. It no longer felt strange to hold something so much larger than my own. "The house is no longer empty," I said, "and neither am I." Outside, the first green shoots pushed through the earth. Inside, the fire burned warm, and two outcasts stood together, human and orc, sword and axe, past and future, finally home. The rope had been cut. The loneliness had been cut with it. And for the first time in many years, the world felt wide open and full of light.